You learned about ancient Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. Teachers told you about the wheel, writing, and agriculture. They never told you about the economic time bomb these same people identified and diffused every generation for over 1,000 years. The Babylonians knew something we have forgotten. They understood compound interest. They watched it destroy families, concentrate land ownership, and destabilize kingdoms. And they built a systematic solution into their legal and religious frameworks. Every 30 to 40 years, the king would stand on the palace steps and proclaim the andurārum. The word translates roughly to return to the mother. All consumer debts canceled, all debt slaves freed, all foreclosed land returned to original families. Modern economists call this a debt jubilee. Ancient Mesopotamians called it survival. Here's the distinction. The Babylonians did not cancel debts out of kindness or religious piety. They canceled debts because they ran the numbers. They understood the mathematics. Compound interest grows exponentially. Agricultural output grows linearly at best. Given enough time, the debt would always exceed the capacity to repay. Always, without exception. The math does not care about hard work or good intentions. The clay tablets from the 3rd dynasty of Ur contain agricultural loan records. Barley loans at 33% annual interest. Silver loans at 20%. Run the calculations yourself. A single barley loan left unpaid for 10 years would require repayment exceeding the total barley harvest of the entire region. The Babylonians were not primitive. They were mathematically literate. They tracked these dynamics. They built escape valves into their economic system because they understood the alternative was social collapse. We removed the escape valves. We kept the compound interest. This is not a story about ancient history. This is a structural analysis of debt mathematics and what happens when civilizations ignore arithmetic. The same exponential functions the Babylonians feared now operate inside your mortgage, your student loans, your credit cards, your government's treasury bonds, and the pension system promising you retirement security. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Here is why this matters to you right now. Global debt reached $307 trillion in 2023. The Institute of International Finance documented this figure. It represents 336% of global economic output. Your government, your employer's pension fund, and your bank all depend on perpetual economic growth to service obligations created under a debt-based monetary architecture. The mathematics have not changed since Babylon. Compound interest still grows exponentially. Real economic output still grows linearly. The gap between these two curves is widening every year. The Babylonians built a reset mechanism. We did not, and the bill is coming due. Before examining why ancient rulers canceled debts, you need to understand how money enters modern economies. The answer will reshape your understanding of every financial headline you read. The Bank of England published a paper in 2014 titled Money Creation in the Modern Economy. This was not a fringe publication or an academic theory. This was the central bank of the world's oldest continuous banking system explaining, in plain language, how money works. The paper states directly, whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. Read the sentence again. Banks do not lend out deposits from other customers. Banks create new money when they issue loans. The money did not exist before the loan. The act of lending creates it. This means approximately 97% of money in circulation in developed economies exists as bank-created debt. The Bank of England confirms this percentage. The Federal Reserve's statistical releases H41 and H8 document the same dynamic in the American context. The European Central Bank's annual reports on monetary aggregates show identical patterns across the Eurozone. Now follow the logic. If nearly all money is created through lending, and all lending requires repayment with interest, then the total debt in the system must always exceed the total money supply. The interest component was never created. It does not exist. To pay the interest, borrowers must obtain money originally lent to other borrowers. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is accounting. The structure creates a mathematical dependency on continuous credit expansion. New loans must be issued to create the money needed to pay interest on old loans. If lending stops or slows significantly, the money supply contracts and widespread defaults become mathematically inevitable, not because borrowers are irresponsible, because the money to repay does not exist in sufficient quantity. The Babylonians faced a simpler version of this same arithmetic. Their silver supply was finite. Interest claims against it were infinite over time. The gap between finite resources and infinite claims could only be resolved through periodic cancellation. Modern central banks attempt to manage this dynamic through interest rate manipulation and quantitative easing programs. They cannot eliminate it. The structural architecture remains. Debt must perpetually expand for the system to avoid contraction. This is the mathematical foundation of what economists call growth imperatives. Your entire economic life operates within this framework. Your job likely exists because of credit expansion somewhere in the economic chain. Your retirement savings require asset price appreciation driven by the same credit expansion. Your government pays its bills by issuing bonds that create new claims on future economic output. The system requires perpetual expansion. Perpetual expansion is physically impossible on a finite planet with finite resources and finite human lifespans. The mathematics collide with physical reality. This collision is not theoretical. It is approaching. The Code of Hammurabi sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Tourists photograph the tall black stone pillar, recognizing it as one of the oldest written legal codes in human history. Most know it for the eye for an eye provisions. Few know it contains sophisticated debt regulations designed to prevent economic collapse. Hammurabi ruled Babylon from 1792 to 1750 BCE. His empire required stable agricultural production, reliable tax collection, and social cohesion among the population. Excessive debt concentration threatened all three. The clay tablet archives from this period, now housed at Harvard's Semitic Museum and translated by economic historian Michael Hudson, document the mechanics of agricultural debt. Farmers borrowed silver or barley for seed, equipment, and subsistence between harvests. They pledged their future crops, their land, and eventually their family members as collateral. Interest rates ranged from 20% on silver to 33% on barley loans. These rates reflected genuine risks. Harvests failed, floods destroyed crops, locusts devastated fields. Lenders faced real possibilities of total loss. But the interest structure created a ratchet effect. One bad harvest pushed a farmer into debt. 2 bad harvests made the debt unpayable. 3 bad harvests meant foreclosure, loss of land, and debt bondage for family members. Now scale this dynamic across an entire population over multiple generations. Land concentrated in the hands of creditors. The farming class shrank. Debt slaves could not serve in the military. Tax bases eroded as productive farmers lost their fields. The social fabric frayed as families disintegrated under debt pressure. Mesopotamian rulers observed these patterns over centuries. They developed a systematic response encoded in the term andurārum in Akkadian and Misharim in Sumerian. Historians translate these concepts as clean slate or restoration of order. The proclamation worked in a specific pattern. Upon ascending the throne and periodically during their reign, kings would declare the cancellation of consumer debts, the liberation of debt slaves, and the return of foreclosed family lands to original owners. Commercial debts between merchants were typically excluded. The system targeted the structural bottleneck of agricultural household debt. Archaeological records document these proclamations across multiple Mesopotamian cultures. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Royal archives from the 3rd dynasty of Ur contain detailed administrative records of debt cancellation implementation. The practice continued for over 1,000 years. This was not occasional charity. This was systematic economic policy. The rulers understood that compound interest created concentration dynamics incompatible with social stability. The reset mechanisms were engineered to preserve the productive capacity of the agricultural base while maintaining the incentive structures necessary for lending to continue. Lenders knew the Jubilee cycle. They adjusted their lending practices accordingly. They could not extend agricultural credit with the expectation of permanent land acquisition. The reset mechanism constrained extractive lending while permitting productive credit formation. The system worked for a millennium. Then it stopped. The transition away from debt jubilees correlates with specific changes in political and economic structure. Understanding this transition explains why modern economies lack reset mechanisms. Mesopotamian debt jubilees depended on palace-centered economies. The king controlled land allocation, military organization, and religious legitimacy. Creditor interests could not override royal authority because the king's power base did not depend on creditor support. The palace economy operated upstream of private lending networks. This changed as merchant classes accumulated sufficient wealth to influence political succession. Archaeological records from later Assyrian and Babylonian periods show declining frequency of Jubilee proclamations. The records also show increasing concentration of landholdings among temple and merchant elites. Classical Greece and Rome developed different political structures. Creditor classes held direct political power through aristocratic institutions. Roman senators were simultaneously the largest landholders and the largest creditors. Debt cancellation threatened their direct economic interests. They controlled the state apparatus that would need to implement cancellations. The Roman economy experienced the same mathematical dynamics the Mesopotamians identified: debt concentration, land consolidation, social instability among displaced farmers, but Rome lacked reset mechanisms. Instead, it experienced periodic violent upheavals, the conflict of the orders, the Gracchi reforms, the social war, civil wars that collapsed the Republic. Roman political instability during the late Republic period correlates directly with debt crises and land concentration. The historical record contains extensive documentation of proposed debt relief legislation and the violent opposition it generated from creditor classes who controlled the Senate. This pattern repeated across subsequent Western civilizations. Medieval European kingdoms answered to creditor interests through various mechanisms. The church banned usury but created workarounds. Italian banking houses financed monarchs who then owed political debts alongside financial ones. The leverage shifted from palace to counting house. Modern democratic states operate within creditor-integrated political frameworks. Bond markets punish governments that threaten bondholder interests. Credit ratings determine borrowing costs. Central bank independence protects monetary policy from electoral pressures. The infrastructure of modern finance creates pressure points that constrain political options. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural description. The Mesopotamian system placed royal authority upstream of creditor interests. Modern systems place creditor interests within the structural architecture of state power itself. The gatekeepers changed. The mathematics did not. The mathematics of compound interest apply to any system requiring perpetual expansion to meet existing obligations. Modern pension systems provide a clear example of these dynamics operating at national scale. Pay-as-you-go pension systems transfer money from current workers to current retirees. The Social Security system in the United States operates this way. Workers pay taxes. Retirees receive benefits. The taxes collected from workers fund the benefits paid to retirees in the same year. The system requires a specific ratio of workers to retirees. More workers than retirees means surpluses. Fewer workers than retirees means deficits. The ratio depends entirely on demographics, birth rates, death rates, and immigration levels. The 2023 annual report of the Social Security Board of Trustees contains official projections. The Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted by 2033. The Disability Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted by 2098. The combined fund depletion date is 2034. After depletion, incoming tax revenue will cover approximately 80% of scheduled benefits. These are not fringe predictions. These are official projections from the government agency responsible for administering the program. The trustees include the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Commissioner of Social Security. Japan provides a more advanced case study. The Japanese Government Pension Investment Fund publishes annual disclosures documenting dependency ratio changes. In 1950, Japan had 12.1 workers for every retiree. In 2020, that ratio had declined to 2.1 workers per retiree. Japan's National Institute of Population and Social Security Research Projects further declined to 1.4 workers per retiree by 2060. The mathematics are transparent. Each Japanese worker must produce enough economic value to support themselves, contribute to the economy, and fund 71% of a retiree's pension. This percentage will increase to approximately 71% of an entire retiree benefit per worker, as the ratio approaches 1.4. South Korea, Italy, Germany, and China face similar documented trajectories. China's working-age population declined by 8.6 million in 2023, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. This decline occurred while pension obligations continued expanding, based on commitments made during periods of demographic growth. The structural parallel to pyramid schemes operates through precise mechanisms. Both systems depend on continuous inflows from new participants to fund obligations to existing participants. Both systems face mathematical collapse when new participant growth slows or reverses. Both systems function normally during growth phases, masking structural vulnerabilities until the growth stops. The difference lies in intent and disclosure. Pension system designers did not intend to create unsustainable structures. Demographic projections during system design suggested continued population growth. The vulnerability emerged from changing conditions, not fraudulent design. The mathematics remain identical regardless of intent. A system requiring perpetual participant growth will fail when growth ends. Demographics determine when, not whether, this failure occurs. Hyman Minsky worked as an economics professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He developed the financial instability hypothesis during the 1960s and 1970s. Mainstream economics largely ignored his work during his lifetime. After the 2008 financial crisis, his name became attached to the concept of a Minsky moment, describing sudden market collapses. Minsky's framework identifies 3 types of financing arrangements in capitalist economies. Understanding these categories explains why financial systems move toward instability as a feature, not a bug. Hedge financing describes arrangements where borrowers generate enough income to pay both principal and interest on their debts. A profitable business, taking a loan for equipment expansion, exemplifies hedge financing. Income covers all obligations. Risk remains contained. Speculative financing describes arrangements where borrowers generate enough income to pay interest but not principal. They must refinance the principal portion at maturity. This works as long as credit markets remain open. Real estate development commonly operates through speculative financing. Projects complete, assets sell, and loans are repaid. But refinancing dependency creates vulnerability to credit market disruptions. Ponzi financing describes arrangements where borrowers cannot cover either principal or interest from income. They depend on asset price appreciation or new borrowing to service existing debts. The name references Charles Ponzi, whose 1920s investment scheme paid early investors with capital from later investors. Minsky observed that capitalist economies naturally progress from hedge to speculative to Ponzi financing over time. During stable periods, profitable investments encourage greater leverage. Success breeds confidence. Confidence reduces risk perception. Reduced risk perception encourages lending standards to loosen. Competition pushes financial institutions toward higher yields available through riskier arrangements. The Levy Economics Institute maintains archives of Minsky's work and correspondence. These records include documented exchanges with Federal Reserve economists during the 1980s. Central bankers privately acknowledged the dynamics Minsky described while publicly maintaining confidence in market stability. The 2008 financial crisis followed Minsky's template precisely. Mortgage lending progressed from conventional qualifying standards through reduced documentation requirements to no documentation loans. Borrowers increasingly depended on home price appreciation to refinance or sell before adjustable rates increased payments. When appreciation stopped, the Ponzi financing layer collapsed. The collapse propagated through speculative arrangements dependent on refinancing. Even hedge-level borrowers faced losses as asset values declined below loan balances. Federal Reserve transcripts from 2007 and 2008 meetings document officials initially dismissing contagion risks before scrambling to implement emergency interventions. The structural progression Minsky predicted played out in real time with documented consequences. Your current economic environment reflects the same progression. Corporate debt at historically elevated levels, stock buybacks funded through borrowing rather than earnings, pension funds requiring asset appreciation to meet obligations, government debt requiring new issuance to service existing bonds. The pyramid dynamics operate across multiple institutional categories simultaneously. Each institution depends on conditions created by other institutions' continued expansion. The interdependencies create systemic fragility invisible during growth phases and catastrophically visible during contractions. The title of this exploration asked whether the global economy operates as a pyramid scheme. The documented evidence supports a more precise conclusion. The global economy contains pyramid-adjacent structural features arising from debt-based monetary architecture, demographic-dependent pension systems, and growth-imperative economic models. The distinction between a pyramid scheme and the current economic system lies primarily in intent and awareness. Pyramid scheme operators knowingly construct fraudulent systems. Economic system architects designed arrangements they believed sustainable under prevailing conditions. Conditions changed. Mathematical vulnerabilities emerged. This distinction matters for determining solutions. Fraudulent schemes require prosecution and shutdown. Structural vulnerabilities require redesign. The Mesopotamians demonstrated that debt-based systems require periodic reset mechanisms to remain stable. They built these mechanisms into their legal, religious, and political frameworks. Modern systems eliminated reset mechanisms while maintaining debt-based foundations. The mathematical consequences of this elimination are now visible in sovereign debt trajectories, pension funding gaps, and asset price dependencies. The Congressional Budget Office projects U.S. federal debt will reach 180% of GDP by 2053. At current interest rates, this implies debt service payments consuming most federal revenue. New borrowing will fund old borrowing. This matches the technical definition of Ponzi financing within Minsky's framework. The International Monetary Fund maintains documented debt sustainability thresholds, identifying danger zones for sovereign borrowing. The research-supported threshold for advanced economies is 77% debt to GDP. 18 of 20 major developed economies currently exceed this threshold. The gatekeepers responsible for monitoring financial stability have documented the breach of their own warning levels. 3 options exist within this structural framework. Option 1 involves engineered inflation. Governments can inflate away existing debt by reducing the real value of fixed obligations. This transfers wealth from creditors to debtors and from savers to borrowers. It represents a form of debt cancellation without formal proclamation. The cost falls on those holding cash and bonds. Option 2 involves default or restructuring. Governments can formally reduce obligations through negotiated haircuts on bondholders, pension benefit reductions, or currency redenomination. This is the modern equivalent of the Mesopotamian Jubilee, achieved through crisis rather than systematic design. Option 3 involves perpetual growth sufficient to outrun the compound interest curve. This requires productivity gains, resource discoveries, or population growth adequate to generate real economic expansion, exceeding debt accumulation rates. Physical constraints on energy, materials, and ecological capacity create upper bounds on this option. The mathematics suggest option 3 faces long-term impossibility. Options 1 and 2 represent different mechanisms for achieving the same outcome the Babylonians formalized: reduction of claims that have grown beyond the capacity to satisfy them. The Babylonians chose when and how to implement resets. They maintained social stability through predictable cycles. Modern systems lack this predictability. Resets occur through crises that distribute costs according to political power rather than systematic design. Your position within this system determines your exposure to reset mechanisms. If you hold debt, inflation benefits you. If you hold savings, inflation harms you. If you depend on pension promises, restructuring threatens you. If you rely on asset appreciation for retirement, market corrections endanger you. The Babylonian farmer knew when the Jubilee would come. The Babylonian creditor priced this knowledge into lending decisions. The system contained uncertainty, but within bounded parameters. You face uncertainty without bounds. The mathematics guarantee a resolution. The timing and form remain unknown. The distribution of costs will be determined by political processes you influence only marginally. This is not financial advice. This is historical analysis applied to documented contemporary conditions. The clay tablets from Ur and Babylon contain warnings written in cuneiform. The spreadsheets from the Congressional Budget Office and the Social Security Administration contain the same warnings written in numbers. Both document the mathematics of compound growth exceeding linear capacity. The Babylonians built escape valves. We remove them. The pressure builds according to the same arithmetic Hammurabi's scribes tracked on clay tablets 4,000 years ago. The variables changed. The equations did not. You now understand why the ancients canceled debts every 30 years. You understand why modern systems do not. You understand the structural consequences of this difference. What you do with this understanding depends on your assessment of when, not whether, the mathematics will force a resolution. The Babylonians would recognize our situation immediately. They would ask a simple question: where is your andurārum? We do not have an answer. Subscribe to Noob Historian for more explorations of the financial systems that shaped history and continue shaping your world. The official story never includes the ledger. We open it.